Harry Potter and Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 11, The Sorting Hat's New Song. Harry did not want to tell the others that he and Luna were having the same hallucination, if that's what it was. So he said nothing more about the horses as he sat down inside the carriage and slammed the door behind him. Nevertheless, he could not help watching the silhouettes of horses moving beyond the window. "Did everyone see that grubbly plank woman?" asked Ginny. "What's she doing back here? Hagrid couldn't have left, can he?" "I'll be quite glad if he has," said Luna. "He isn't a very good teacher, is he?" "Yes, he is," said Harry, Ron, and Ginny angrily. Harry glared at Hermione. She cleared her throat and quickly said, yes, he's very good." "Well, we in Ravenclaw think he's a bit of a joke," said Luna, unfazed. "You've got a rubbish sense of humor, then," Ron snapped as the wheels below them creaked into motion. Luna did not seem perturbed by Ron's rudeness. On the contrary, she simply watched him for a while as though he were a mildly interesting television program. Rattling and swaying, the carriages moved in a convoy up the road. When they passed between the tall stone pillars topped with winged boars on either side of the gates to the school grounds, Harry leaned forward to try and see whether there were any lights on in Hagrid's cabin by the Forbidden Forest. But the grounds were in complete darkness. Hogwarts Castle, however, loomed ever closer, a towering mass of turrets, jet black against the dark sky, here and there a window blazing fiery right above them. The carriages jingled to a halt near the stone steps leading to up the oak front doors, and Harry got out of the carriage first. He turned again to look for lit windows down the forest, but there was definitely no sign of life within Hagrid's cabin. Unwillingly, because he had half hoped they would have vanished, he turned his eyes instead upon the strange skeletal creature standing quietly in the chill night air, and the blank white eyes gleaming. Harry had once before had the experience of seeing something that Ron could not, but that had been a reflection in the mirror, something much more insubstantial than 100 very solid-looking beasts strong enough to pull a fleet of carriages. If Luna was to be believed, the beasts had always been there, but were invisible. Why, then, could Harry suddenly see them, and why could Ron not? "Are you coming or what?" said Ron beside him. "Oh, yeah," said Harry quickly, as they joined the crowd hurrying up the stone steps into the castle. The entrance hall was ablaze with torches and echoing with footsteps as the students crossed the flagged stone floor for the double doors to the right, leading to the great hall and the start of term feast. The four long house tables in the great hall were filling up under the starless black sky, which was just like the sky they had glimpsed through the high windows. Candles floating in mid-air all along the tables, illuminating the silvery ghosts who were dotted about the hall, and the faces of the students talking eagerly, exchanging summer news, shouting greetings at friends from other houses, eyeing one another's new haircuts and robes. Again, Harry noticed people putting their heads together to whisper as he passed. He gritted his teeth and tried to act as though he neither noticed nor cared. Luna drifted away from them at the Ravenclaw table. The moment they reached Gryffindor's, Ginny was hailed by some of the fellow fourth years and left to sit with them. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville found seats together about halfway down the table between Nearly Headless Nick, the Gryffindor house ghost, and Parvati Patil in lavender brown. The last of two whom gave Harry airy, overly friendly greetings that made him quite sure that they had stopped talking about him a split second before. He had more important things to worry about, however. He was looking over the students, heads to the staff tables, and ran along the top walls of the hall. "He's not there." Ron and Hermione scanned the staff table too. Though there was no real need, Hagrid's size made him instantly obvious in any lineup. He can have left, said Ron, sounding slightly anxious. Of course he hasn't, said Harry firmly. You don't think he's hurt or anything, do you? Asked Hermione uneasily. No, Harry said at once. But where is he then? There was a pause. Then Harry said very quietly, so that Neville and Parvati and Lavender could not hear, maybe he's not back yet. You know, from his mission, the thing he was doing over the summer for Dumbledore? Yeah, that'll be it, said Ron, sounding reassured, but Hermione bit her lip, looking up and down the staff table as though hoping for some conclusive explanation for Hagrid's absence. Who's that? She asked sharply, pointing towards the middle of the staff table. Harry's eyes followed her. They lit first upon Professor Dumbledore, sitting in the high-backed golden chair from the center of the long staff table, wearing deep purple robes scattered with silvery stars and a matching hat. Dumbledore's head was inclined towards a woman sitting next to him who was talking into his ear. She looked, Harry thought, like somebody's maiden's aunt, squat with short, curly, mouse-brown hair, in which she has placed a horrible pink Alice band, which matched the fluffy pink cardigan she wore over her robes. Then she turned her face slightly to take a sip of her goblet, and he saw, with a shock of recognition, a pallid, toad-like face and a pair of prominent, pouchy eyes. It's that Umbridge woman. Who? Said Hermione. She was at my hearing. She works for Fudge. Nice cardigan, said Ron, smirking. She works for Fudge? Hermione repeated, frowning. What on earth's she doing here, then? Don't know. Harry scanned the staff table, near her eyes narrowing. Hermione scanned the staff table. No, she muttered. No, surely not. Harry did not understand what she was talking about, but did not ask. His attention had been caught by Professor Grumblyplank, who had just appeared behind the staff table. She worked her way along to the very end and took the seat that ought to have been Hagrid's. That meant the first years must have crossed the lake and reached the castle. And sure enough, a few seconds later, the doors from the entrance hall opened. A long line of scared-looking first years entered, led by Professor McGonagall, who was carrying a stool by which sat an ancient wizard hat, heavily patched and darned with a wide rip near the frayed brim. The buzz of talk in the great hall faded away. The first years lined up in front of the staff table, facing the rest of the students, and Professor McGonagall placed the stool carefully in front of them, then stood back. The first year faces growled palely in the candlelight. A small boy, right to the middle of the row, looked as though he was trembling. Harry recalled fleetingly how terrified he had felt when he stood there waiting for the unknown test that would determine to which house he belonged. The whole school waited with bated breath. Then the rip near the hat's brim opened wide, like a mouth, and the Sorting Hat burst into song. In times of old, when I was new, and Hogwarts barely started, the founders of our noble school thought never to be parted. United by a common goal, they had a selfsame yearning to make the world's best magic school and pass along their learning. Together we will build and teach, the four good friends decided. They never did they dream that they might someday be divided. For were there such friends anywhere as Slytherin and Gryffindor? Unless it was the second pair of Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw. So how could it have gone so wrong? How could such friendship fail? Why, I was there, so I can tell the whole sad, sorry tale. Said Slytherin will teach that those whose ancestry is purest. Said Ravenclaw will teach those with intelligence is surest. Said Gryffindor, "We'll teach all those with bravest deeds to their names." Said Hufflepuff, "I'll teach the lot and treat them just the same." These differences caused little strife when first they came to light, for each of the four founders had a house in which they might take only those they wanted. So, for instance, Slytherin took only one's pureblood wizards of great cunning just like him, and only those of sharpest mind were taught by Ravenclaw. While the bravest and the boldest went to daring Gryffindor, good Hufflepuff she took the rest, and she taught them all she knew. Thus the houses and their founders reigned friendships firm and true, so Hogwarts worked in harmony for several happy years. But then discord crept among us, feeding on our faults and fears. The houses that, like pillars four, had once held up our school, now turned upon each other and, divided, sought to rule. And for a while it seemed the school must meet an early end. What with dueling and the fighting and the clash of friend on foe, and at last there came a morning when Slytherin departed. And though the fighting then died out and left us quite downhearted, never since the founders four were wilted down to three. Have the houses been united as they once were meant to be, and now the Sorting Hat is here, and you all know the score. I sort you into houses because that is what I'm meant for. But this year I go further, listen closely to my song. Though condemned I am to split you, still I worry that is wrong. Though I must fulfill my duty, I must quarter every year, still I wonder whether sorting may not bring the end I fear. Oh, know the perils, know the signs, the warning history shows. For our Hogwarts is in danger from external deadly foes, and we must unite inside her, or will crumble from within. I have told you, I have warned you. Let the sorting now begin. The hat became motionless once more. Applause broke out, though it was punctured, for the first time in Harry's memory, the muttering and the whispers. All across the hall, students were exchanging remarks with their neighbors, and Harry clapped along. Everyone else knew exactly what they were talking about. "Branched out a bit this year, didn't he?" asked Ron, his eyebrows raised. "Too right it has." The Sorting Hat usually confined itself to describing the four houses looked for by each of the four Hogwarts houses, and its own role in sorting them. Harry could not remember ever trying to give the school advice before. "I wonder if it's ever given warnings before," said Hermione, sounding slightly anxious. "Yes, indeed," said Nearly Headless Nick knowledgeably, leaning across Neville towards her. Neville winced. It was very uncomfortable to have a ghost lean through you. "The hat feels itself honor bound to give the school advice, due warning, whenever it feels." But Professor McGonagall, who was waiting to read out the list of first year's names, was giving the whispering students the sort of look and scorches. Nearly Headless Nick placed a see-through finger to his lips and sat primly upright again, and muttering came to an abrupt halt. With his last frowning look that swept the four tables, Professor McGonagall lowered her eyes to her long piece of parchment and called out the first name. "Abercrombie Ewan?" The terrified-looking boy Harry had noticed earlier stumbled forward and put the hat on his head. It was only prevented from falling right down to his shoulders by the very prominent ears. Harry considered for a moment that the rip near the brim and the hat considered for a moment, and the rip near the brim opened and shouted, "Gryffindor!" Harry clapped loudly with the rest of the Gryffindor house as Aaron Abercrombie staggered to the table and sat down, looking as though he would like very much to sink through the floor and never be looked at again. Slowly, the long line of first years thinned. It paused between names and the Sorting Hat's decisions. Harry could hear Ron's stomach rumbling loudly. Finally, Zeller, Rose was sorted into Hufflepuff, and Professor McGonagall picked up the hat and stool and marched them away as Professor Dumbledore rose to his feet. Whenever the recent bitter feelings had been towards his headmaster, Harry was somehow soothed to see Dumbledore standing before them all. Between the absence of Hagrid and the presence of those dragonish horses, he had felt that his return to Hogwarts, so long anticipated, was full of unexpected surprises, like jarring notes in a familiar song. But this, at least, was how it was supposed to be, his headmaster rising to greet them, all before the start of term feast. "To our newcomers," Dumbledore said in a rising voice, his arms stretched wide and the beaming smile on his lips. "Welcome. To our old hands, welcome back. There is a time for speech making, but this is not it. Tuck in." There was an appreciative laugh as the outbreak of applause as Dumbledore sat down neatly and threw his long beard over his shoulder as to keep it out of the way from his plate. For food had appeared out nowhere, now that 5 long tables were groaning under the joints of pies and dishes of vegetables, breads and sauces, flagons of pumpkin juice. "Excellent," said Ron, with a kind of groan of longing, and he seized the nearest plate of chops and began piling them on his plate, watching wistfully as nearly headless Nick. "What were you saying before the Sorting Hat?" Hermione asked the ghost, all about the hat's giving warnings. "Oh, yes," said Nick, who seemed glad of a reason to turn away from Ron, who was now eating roast potatoes with almost indecent enthusiasm. "Yes, I heard the hat give several warnings before, always at times when it detects periods of great danger for the school. As always, of course, its advice is the same. Stand together, be strong, from within." "No discovered danger inflicted?" said Ron. His mouth was so full, Harry thought it was quite an achievement for him to make any noise at all. "I beg your pardon?" said nearly headless Nick politely, while Hermione looked revolted. Ron gave an enormous swallow and said, "How can it know if the school's in danger, if it's a hat?" "I have no idea," said nearly headless Nick. "Of course it does live in Dumbledore's office, so I dare say it picks up a few things up there." "And it wants all the houses to be friends," said Harry, looked over at the Slytherin table, where Draco Malfoy was holding court. "Fat chance." "Well, now you shouldn't take that attitude," said Nick reprovingly. "Peaceful cooperation, that's the key. We ghosts, though we belong to separate houses, maintain links of friendship. In spite of the competitiveness between Gryffindor and Slytherin, I would never dream of seeking an argument with the Bloody Baron." "Only because you're terrified of him," said Ron. Nearly headless Nick looked highly affronted. "Terrified? I hope Sir Nicholas de Mimbley Porpington I've never heard his whole full name. Look at that. They have never been guilty of cowardice in my life. The noble blood that runs in my veins." "What blood?" asked Ron. "Surely you don't got any." "It's a figure of speech," said nearly headless Nick, now so annoyed that his head was trembling ominously on his partially severed neck. "I assume I'm still allowed to enjoy the use of whichever words I like, even if the pleasures of eating and drinking are denied me. But I am quite used to students poking fun at my death, I assure you." "Nick, he wasn't really laughing at you," said Hermione, throwing a furious look at Ron. Unfortunately, Ron's mouth was packed to exploding point again, and all he could manage was "not an institute," which Nick did not seem to think constituted an adequate apology. Rising into the air, he straightened his feathered hat and swept away from them to the other end of the table, coming to rest between Creevy brothers, Colin and Dennis. "Well done, Ron." "What?" said Ron indignantly, having managed finally to swallow his food. "I'm not allowed to ask a simple question?" "Oh, forget it," said Hermione irritably, and the pair of them spent the rest of the meal in huffy silence. Harry was too used to their bickering to bother trying to reconcile them. He felt it was better use of his time to eat his way steadily through his steak and kidney pie. Then a large plateful of his favorite treacle tart. When all the students had finished eating and the noise level of the great hall started to creep upward again, Dumbledore got to his feet once more. Talking ceased immediately, and all turned to face the headmaster. Harry was feeling pleasantly drowsy now. His four-poster bed was waiting somewhere above, wonderfully warm and soft. "Well, now that we are all digesting another magnificent feast, I beg to few moments of your attention for the usual start of term notices," said Dumbledore. "First years ought to know the forest of the grounds is out of bounds to students, and a few of our older students ought to know by now, too." Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged smirks. "Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me, for what he tells me is the 462nd time, to remind you all that magic is not permitted in the corridors between classes, nor are a number of other things, all of which can be checked on the extensive list now fastened to Mr. Filch's office door. We have 2 changes in staffing this year. We are pleased to welcome back Professor Gumblyplank, who will be taking care of magical creatures lessons. We are also delighted to introduce Professor Umbridge, our new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher." There was a round of polite but fairly unenthusiastic applause, during which Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged slightly panicked looks. Dumbledore had not said for how long Grubbly Plank would be teaching. Dumbledore continued, "Tryouts for the house Quidditch teams will take place on the—" He broke off, looking inquiringly at Professor Umbridge. As she was not much taller standing than sitting, there was a moment where nobody understood why Dumbledore had stopped talking, but then Professor Umbridge cleared her throat. And it became clear that she had got to her feet and was intending to make a speech. Dumbledore only looked taken aback for a moment. Then he sat down smartly, looked alertly at Professor Umbridge, as though he desired nothing better than to listen to her talk. Other members of the staff were now as adept as hiding their surprise. Professor Sprout's eyes had disappeared into her flyaway hair, and Professor McGonagall's mouth was in a thin line, thin as Harry had ever seen. No new teacher has ever interrupted Dumbledore before. Many of the students were smirking. This woman obviously did not know how things were done at Hogwarts.